We're in danger of running out of time here with chatting, so I might actually, if we can, take us to the really controversial one, I guess, which is the aluminium sector, just to bookend this debate.
Thank you. So if we have a look at page 14, firstly, the aluminium sector has two issues floating around. One is whether or not it pays market electricity prices. Most of the Australian aluminium refining industry, got it the wrong way around again, smelting industry, sorry. Tristan has been trying for several months to try and get me to get smelting and refining the right way round.
It's a good thing that John's the CEO, really, isn't it?
It's a good thing that Tristan is here. If it pays a market electricity price, some of the Australian facilities will be in trouble. Many of them will be significantly higher cost facilities at the moment than they are at the moment, but nevertheless, they'll change. Nevertheless, they'll still be profitable mostly. If, however, they pay a carbon price, that'll make life difficult. And if they both move to market electricity pricing, which is happening because essentially electricity prices are rolling off because we've privatised our electricity industry, and they pay a carbon price, they're going to be in deep, deep trouble. And this positioning of being high fourth quartile producers, in other words, right at the right-hand end of those cost curves that we started off looking at, means that by and large they're going to struggle to be profitable, and the chances of those facilities closing are very high. However, if we move to the next slide, the key question is whether or not Australian production moving offshore will result in higher or lower global emissions. And the key question here is not can we find a plant somewhere in China that has higher emissions than one of the Australian plants. The question is, does the industry that replaces it across the world, on average, have higher or lower emissions? And the answer to that, we believe, is very compellingly no. Replacement capacity, on average, will have substantially lower emissions. If you look at the top chart, Australian production today is substantially higher than the international aluminium industry global average. If you look at where people are talking about putting their new facilities in terms of the power source, it's much more about zero carbon emissions sources, to some extent gas, a bit of coal, but relative to the Australian industry, which is dominated by coal, on average, substantially lower emissions. And if you look at the investor presentations and so on of all of the Western aluminium producers, they're all telling their investors exactly the same thing, namely, we're all planning on being lower than the global average for emissions intensity in terms of aluminium production. Now, by definition, they can't all be less than average. It's sort of a bit of a Lake Wobegon effect. Nevertheless, they're all worrying very hard about how do we put our facilities somewhere that have substantially lower emissions, preferably with substantially lower electricity costs. And that's why we believe, if you look at the current, if you look at the planned, if you look at the kind of strategic intent, all of these things are pointing in the same direction about going to low emissions electricity. And the reality is that doesn't mean Australia. We don't have low emissions electricity. We have some of the world's highest emissions. So that's the story.
Okay, and so the conclusion is, effectively, because shutting down would reduce overall emissions in the world, your $8.1 billion is better spent elsewhere.
In a nutshell. And it's worth remembering, and I guess one of the things we try and bring the report back to is, why are we doing this? Why are we imposing carbon pricing in the first place? And the answer is because we're trying to reduce carbon emissions. That's the idea. And if one of the impacts of that is that it's rational for industry to move somewhere other than Australia where it'll have substantially lower emissions, that's the idea. That's what we're trying to do as a globe, is get industry to move places where it'll have the least emissions per unit of production.
I think the other thing that's worth stating in this particular case is that with some industries, it's not clear-cut. So in cement, so if we took cement as an example, most of the cement clinker that we've imported, from the data that I could obtain, was from Japan. Japan generally produces clinker or cement clinker with lower emissions. But overall, the benefit is marginal, such that you couldn't emphatically say it would be a good idea economically to shift cement clinker overseas and to shut down Australian production. But in aluminium, the difference is so large that you start to think, I think if we had a global regime, it would be efficient for Australian smelters.
Well, if we had market-based electricity prices for a start, we probably wouldn't have the aluminium sector to begin with. But you're then effectively saying on top of that, if you then got rational pricing everywhere, then clearly you would not smelt aluminium using coal-fired power stations.
Not in Australia.
Well, arguably not anywhere, in fact. But Okay, look, I've got a range of other questions, but I do want to open it up to the floor. So we have some roving microphones, I think, somewhere. Do we? Yep, great. So just want to go to the middle here, if we can. And I think the audio is being captured. So if you can hold your question until you get the mic, that would be appreciated.
Dennis O'Neill, Resource Futures. Taking that strategic overview, though, something that you haven't factored into your analysis and probably outside your scope, but I'd just like to put it to you that it's probably worthwhile considering. Whereas aluminium smelting might be an activity that the economy can afford to lose because there are no strategic implications for the functioning of the economy and the resulting loss of employment, etc. Arguably, if we push fuel refining entirely offshore, there may be serious strategic implications and therefore a cost to the economy as a result of interdiction of supply or other issues such as we experienced in recent years with jet fuel being in short supply and so on. So I feel that there's an externality here associated with some of those analyses that should be costed and factored into your conclusions, such that government support, for example, for the retention of some domestic refining capacity does have a strategic imperative which is worthwhile considering. And a second point, again at the strategic level, if we do end up with a level playing field in terms of energy costing, given, for example, the comments by the head of Rusal a few weeks ago here in Melbourne, that inside of a decade, most of the world's excess hydro capacity will be used up and therefore won't be available to expansion of the global aluminium smelting industry, and that the future, in his view, is nuclear. Could we not see merely, rather than shifting aluminium smelting offshore, a gradual introduction by replacement of coal-fired energy supply to the aluminium smeltery by nuclear?
Can we just touch off on the nuclear question first? I think this is a point that's been flagged with us in some other conversations, and I think the point that we would look at is what's the time frame on which we could see a substitution of our current coal-fired electricity fleet with lower emission sources. Okay, yes, we've got all the uranium that we could possibly need to do this, but we don't have the infrastructure and the skills yet anyway to do it, and according to the Switkowski report, we'd need quite a considerable amount of time to implement that. So one, we're looking at a long lead time. The second thing is that we're not necessarily going to be doing it at the same scale as existing countries that have a nuclear fleet, have the capacity there, and I suspect it would be difficult for us to achieve a nuclear-powered electricity supply at lower cost than other countries that have a more established industry, such as, say, France or Russia, for example. So that would touch on that.
Just picking up on this, Dennis, the broader implication of what you've raised in that second point you made is actually about the dynamic nature or versus static nature of the modelling, which is picked up in the report. Effectively, and I think this is quite clear, the report says this is static-based modelling on what we see today. Because I can imagine a comeback from you on Tristan's comments that said, but actually what the biggest problem here is maybe there's a 15-year window where we lose an industry that otherwise we wouldn't have lost had we taken different action and seen through the period. And I think in general the report does acknowledge that actually this is a static view, but in terms of the time frames we're talking about, and in terms of effectively CPRS legislation being in front of Parliament within the next 3-5 years, let's say, this is something that needs to be decided, right? I did say within 3 to 5 years.
But I think though on that, I mean, we are genuinely sceptical about Australia being able to provide electricity at low carbon and low prices.
I mean, there's that too, but I think that in the context of what you're trying to achieve with the report, it is very much a foreseeable time frame issue.
Well, I think that one of the issues for the aluminium industry is we would need to be lower cost, lower emissions than the rest of the world.
Right.
It's, as Tristan points out, it's really hard to see that happening within 20 years. So in the meantime, we're going to basically be paying, in the order of $8 billion to keep this thing alive for 10 years.
On the off chance
that maybe there's a miracle,
Yep.
and frankly, in 20 years' time, people will be building, any aluminium plant that exists today will probably be shut down and replaced with, a shiny new plant that looks different. The second issue that you raised around oil refining is actually something that we do deal with in detail in the detailed analysis. And the way that we put it is this. You need to distinguish between security of domestic supply, i.e. for you and me to drive our cars, and security of supply to, for defence purposes in terms of providing fuel for tanks and fighter planes and all that kind of stuff. In terms of security of domestic supply, it's actually arguable, in fact we think very arguable, that security would actually improve if we stopped refining in Australia. And that's because the biggest threat to security of supply in Australia is in fact that the very old Australian refineries, they're all old by world standards, have significant interruptions to supply because they're old plant and they basically break down and it takes them a while to get it fixed. Whereas if you're dealing with very large refineries offshore, number one, because they're kind of new shiny plants, they break down less often. And number two, your supply is coming on a ship, and if a particular plant shuts down, it's relatively easy to try and get shipments from another plant. And bear in mind, we're already vulnerable to the shipping.
We're already short. Yeah.
We're already vulnerable to shipping. By definition, a lot of the stuff is coming as crude oil anyway. So, in fact, if anything, security of domestic supply probably improves if we have more refining that's coming from offshore. Secondly, in terms of defence security, number one, we would need to substantially retool the Australian plants if we were serious about using Australian-produced oil for defence purposes. They're not actually set up to produce those kind of fuels at the moment. And secondly, you wouldn't need anything like the number of plants that we have at the moment. And thirdly, if that's what you are really worried about it, far better to have a direct targeted subsidy that's aimed at that problem rather than trying to do it indirectly through some kind of free permitting regime that may not even have the right desired effect.
Okay, any other questions? We'll go here just for logistics purposes and then I'll come back over to the front here.
Matthew Reddy, Carbon Advantage. My question's about arriving at the $35 price point for carbon. I mean, my carbon crystal ball is the same as anybody else's, so I wouldn't exactly say that today, and taking that point on board, that yes, this is a snapshot of where we are today, that $35 is at all realistic, and given the offset prices around the AU dollar 20 mark, how would the scenario play out if we had a $20 carbon price?
I think you could replicate it and say that it's proportionally lower. Yeah. Is the simple thing. $35. We looked at the Treasury modelling. We said this is what the price roughly is. It goes a bit above $35 if you do it in real terms. But we said, look, this is a reasonable assessment. We could probably do $40 and we'd probably come up with very similar results. But 35 seemed like a reasonable level over the outlook period to 2020.
I guess my question would be, how low does it have to be to save the aluminium industry? Which I suspect is zero, or it might even be negative.
Yeah, I guess that's the point of, as the aluminium industry moves to market electricity pricing, it's going to need to be very low. And it's not like we're saying that the Australian government should, legislate to say that the aluminium industry has to move offshore. We're just saying that they shouldn't be, paying at large sums of money to stay here. And if the aluminium industry winds up being viable at $20, well, that's how it is. And that's terrific. And the whole point about creating market-based schemes is that you let the market do the work for you.
Okay, sorry, there's a question over here.
Hi, Dan Cass. I really like your report. It's great, very clear. And I like what your graphic designer has done with the very reassuring kind of neoclassical T effect. As the carbon prices peak and the skies collapse, it's nice to have a bit of solidity. I just wanted...
Where is this going to go now?
No, it's really simple and quick. The interim carbon price idea from Ross Garnaut now being championed by the senators and the Green senators, but apparently not with any particular interest from Penny Wong. What do you think of the interim carbon price? And the price level that Garno has recommended for it?
Look, I think the short answer is, any carbon price is, a carbon price is better than no carbon price. A carbon price sooner rather than later is something that will help us get started on the way towards restructuring the Australian economy. So we would say a good thing. In terms of the precise level, you can have lots of arguments about, do you make it $10 or $15 or $20 or $30? And I guess the point of our analysis is that at $35, it's not going to be the end of the Australian economy. But clearly, $35 is going to send a pretty sharp signal to business to change its emissions. And a lower price will send a weaker signal, but on the other hand, have less of an impact.
Hi, Patrick Hopes, Beyond Zero Emissions. Can I just, looking at the CPRS, so you've said that it wouldn't necessarily have an effect on the industries. Would the CPRS actually reduce emissions from these industries? Under the work that you've done, and how so? So, I mean, have you looked at, say, you had steel making up there, blast oxygen furnace steel making? Would we see a shift to, say, direct iron reduction, a more efficient form of steel making that can use gas, for example? And do you think, what about, would the carbon price or the CPRS encourage, say, getting the low emissions energy that we need that could make the aluminium industry more competitive, for example? So, I mean, you were talking before what you need for aluminium, you need good, cheap, renewable electricity. I mean, Queensland's got an awesome solar resource. You could use baseload solar thermal power there. Have you looked at that at all?
I think the short answer is no. We haven't, except to the extent that we have looked at how the free permits actually might pervert a shift, say, for example, from blast furnaces to electric arc furnaces, which would lead to a more than a halving of emissions using the existing fleet of the existing plant. And that's because the amount of free permits that you receive per tonne of steel under the current provisions are less for electric arc than they are for blast furnaces. So it actually blunts or mutes the incentive to shift from, a blast furnace to a lower emission electric arc furnace. As for direct reduction iron, that's another level of analysis that we certainly didn't do. And in fact, we excluded the one operating plant. And from the analysis that I looked at, it didn't look like it would necessarily reduce emissions at all to move to that particular plant. So I sort of struggled to understand how it was going to improve our emissions anyway.
I think more generally, the mere fact that an industry is profitable doesn't mean that it's not going to do everything it can to be more profitable. That's capitalism. That's the idea. And if an industry can improve its profitability by reducing its carbon emissions and therefore reducing the number of permits it's got to buy, we believe that'll happen. And indeed, that's the whole point of the report, is to say that we need to make those incentives as clear as possible. In terms of how much of a difference it will make, you may well be aware that Climate Works has recently produced a very detailed analysis with some assistance from McKinsey & Company, looking at what are the detailed things that might happen if you start imposing prices. And I guess one of the conclusions of that report is a huge number of things become economic and smart things to do if you have a carbon price of $35. We do talk about a couple of those in the report, but they're frankly illustrative examples as distinct from the kind of work that Climate Works has done, which is an attempt to be rather more comprehensive. I think one of the things that does come out of that report is it's a huge number of things, and for governments to try and create direct action for every single one of these things is going to be very difficult for governments to do. And the whole point about the invisible hand of the market is that you send a market signal and let, thousands of companies around the country try and figure out how to be more profitable. And if you're trying to get change, lots of small changes across an economy that add up to quite a big change, then the classic way to do that is to send a market signal and let the kind of invisible hand do its invisible thing.
Okay, so we had a question up the back.
Thanks, Tristan and John, for some interesting work. Ross Garno, University of Melbourne. Just a couple of things that you didn't take into account that I think it's worth thinking about. One is what economists call general equilibrium effects. If you close down one plant or one industry, that reduces costs of other plants and industries and reduces the real exchange rate makes all tradable goods and services industries, including universities, more profitable. And it's not going to be that all of those 30% of emissions in that set of industries are going to close. And if what happens is you get less investment in aluminium and steel or whatever it is, then that will reduce the costs of other industries, all other exportable and import competing industries through the real exchange rate, all other resources industries through the cost pressures. We're in a resources boom. Capital costs of power generation have increased about 60% in a few years because of the shortage of resources in the resources boom. Have a bit less investment in some industries and costs go down for everyone else. So that's one factor that needs to be taken into account, the general equilibrium factor. So to that extent, you've probably overestimated the effect on costs. Secondly, there's a premise of some of the presentation that the rest of the world isn't doing anything. But that is actually not the case. At the margin in Europe, most companies are paying a carbon price, most of the time as high or higher than you're assuming here, although at the moment lower. A lot of states in the United States and provinces of Canada have got measures that are increasing costs quite a lot. Spent a day in the National Development and Reform Commission in Beijing 2 weeks ago just catching up with what they're doing to meet their very ambitious goals of reducing emissions intensity by 40 to 45% by 2020. And that involves radical increases in the role of a whole range of renewable energy and nuclear energy. And they're just forcing that onto the costs of the energy-intensive industries, forcing them to wear it. South Africa has a carbon tax in the electricity sector, so that if our aluminium smelters compete with the smelter in Richards Bay, we're not competing on a level playing field. There's a huge growth in East Asian demand for natural gas, partly because of a range of environmental considerations, including emissions intensity, which is causing Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and China to favour natural gas. That's putting up the regional and world price of natural gas, and therefore increasing the profitability of all of these industries. So that's why in my report I said the principle we should be applying for the tradable goods industries is compensating for the difference between the world prices we're facing and the world prices that we would face if the rest of the world had a carbon price, and that would be nothing like the compensation that takes the form of compensating for the fact that we have a carbon price.
And I'd just say, you're absolutely right, Ross. We can't. Unfortunately, we don't have a general equilibrium model at our disposal. And I think the other thing is, and this doesn't take anything away from your points. You're absolutely right. I think where we saw a gap that wasn't being filled was helping to explain or fill in what essentially the Treasury model tells you what happens, but it doesn't tell you how it arrives at its result. And so we tried to open up the black box for everyone else to see what's going on inside and why we end up with the impact actually not being that big a deal for the economy. Because when I say to some people, well, look, someone will say to me, and I used to get this response all the time, once people realise just how much energy prices are going to go up, they are going to hit the roof. And I said, you know what, people spend more on alcohol and cigarettes than they do spend on electricity and gas. And that's a big surprise to some people. They don't actually realise that because they think it's such a fundamental and important good, which it is, that we can't do without, that therefore this would be a monumental effect on the economy. And what we've tried to do is essentially illustrate to people using the hard numbers for physical facilities why this is not such a big deal. So we're not trying to replace the Treasury modelling. We're merely trying to complement it with something else that helps people to understand why we have the effects that we do.
I guess if the worst that can be said of our report is that we've actually overestimated the impact on the economy when we've said this ain't a big deal, that's a good problem to have. And I guess that's the key message, is this is not such a big deal. And as you point out, actually, if you refine the modelling, you'd probably find it was an even smaller deal than the one that we've outlined.
Okay, we've probably got time for one more question.
Thank you. My name's Greg Zorf. I work for a company called Nearstar. We actually operate a couple of large EITEs in regional areas in Australia, South Australia and Tasmania. Firstly, one of the things that's glaring in the report is that you highlight the cost of the so-called subsidy, I guess, but you don't actually do any analysis, and I think it's probably raised to what Ross was saying before, that there's no other economic modelling around what's the loss of economic output from these facilities, because they do operate in regional areas. They have very large multiplier effects. So that's sort of one comment. The other one also, I think to look at a cost curve and then to add a carbon price, I think is pretty sort of one-dimensional analysis. You need to look at the gross profit risks as well, and you also, because each industries have a number of challenges, and certainly in our industry, zinc and lead, it's going through some challenges and structural reforms or changes. The other thing is that there's no mention of RET. There's no mention of transmission price risks in the report, because they all are, I guess, part of the climate change impacts. And just one last comment is around the abatement. You say that although, I'll just read out here, although the number of free permits declines by around 1% per annum, many industries would be capable of reducing emissions much faster than this. Now, if you're actually already operating best available technology, I mean, I don't think there's a lot of scope in reducing 1% per annum. So,
can I take those points in turn? Firstly, around the multiplier effects, I guess one of the ways that we thought about this is, and it's a generic point about industry assistance, the question is not whether a $20,000 industry $20,000 per job industry subsidy results in a job with multiplier effects. The question is whether that $20,000 could result in higher impacts if it was spent in a different way. And if you look at the kind of subsidies that are being provided to these industries, to take, for example, aluminium, at $160,000 a job, that's got to be one of the least effective job creation schemes anywhere in the world. There have got to be better ways of creating jobs than subsidies at $160,000 a job.
With equivalent multiplier effects in the economy, I think.
Yeah, well, with equivalent multiplier effects, but, geez, $160,000, you can, there's a lot of multiplier effect, room to play with. Yeah. Secondly, in terms of the gross profit risks, and I guess you pointed to the cost curves and the way that we've done it, I guess one of the things that kind of drops out of those cost curves is the impact of a carbon price is relatively small for the industries which we think are not at risk in the scheme of things. And yes, of course, those industries are subject to a whole series of impacts. And yes, of course, carbon pricing could be the straw that breaks the camel's back, and you can always make that argument. But for all of the industries we've shown, what's pretty clear is that either, one, the camel's looking really, really healthy, or secondly, the camel's looking very, very sick. And, just as it is, just the way the analysis has popped out, there's very few things on the margin. And for steel and cement, which we do believe are on the margin, we've suggested what we think is a much better way of supporting them. And I guess what we would say is, look, inevitably, somewhere in the Australian economy, there will be a camel for which a straw winds up breaking, that particular camel's back. That's always got to be possible. But if we're going to use that as a reason for creating, a vast herd of camels at enormous cost to the Australian economy, we say that's not the right way to do it. The smart way to do this is to say that inevitably there will be a marginal effect somewhere in the economy. That's the life of having an economy. There's always something at the margin. That's the whole point about supply and demand curves, is they meet at the margin. But overall, we will all be substantially better off if we shift towards carbon pricing. And finally, in terms of 1% reductions, well, I don't know, but certainly when I was at McKinsey, and I think if you talk to most lean manufacturers, they'll say, look, if you can't get 1% a year, that's kind of standard industry practice at least to get that kind of reduction. And although you might be best practice today, the whole point about lean manufacturing and pushing towards continuous improvement is that you say you're going to push year after year after year after year and push out the efficient frontier. And I'd suggest 1% a year in terms of pushing the efficient frontier is not a particularly aggressive target.
Yeah, can I just... obviously, I don't know all the particulars about New Star, but I did have some involvement in the company a while ago when it was going through a restructuring process. But we've got a case study in the report, and it's hidden, I don't know, page 50 or something like that. But it talks about the Rockhampton cement clinker plant. Now, there was a lot of press about the closure of that plant when it occurred in 2009. And we went back and looked at what had happened subsequently to that plant. And when you look at it, yes, it closed down. Yes, it was a marginal plant that really carbon pricing hurt it significantly. But then you sit there and you think, you know what? That plant was going to close anyway. And that's because there was a better, more modern, bigger plant down the road, owned by the same company. And guess what? Those people that lost their jobs, those that wanted a job in the new plant got a job. I'm not saying that's the same case for New Star, but we're not about preserving industries or facilities that perhaps are facing an inevitable closure anyway, and that there's a limit to what government can do in terms of preserving the viability of particular facilities that are in the wrong location, using really old technology, or their source of perhaps their ore, for example, has dried up, and so they're getting it from a long way away. And so their cost structure is changing over time such that it's becoming increasingly difficult to compete because time has moved on. Now, I'm not saying that that's necessarily the case for those particular ones, but we shouldn't be judging a government policy by the most marginal plant that's out there and ensuring that continues to operate, because otherwise it would be okay.
And I guess the final thing I would add to that, and I hope this is reasonably clear from the report, is if that's the situation that we're facing, the right way to use government money, our money, taxpayer money, is not to pay the producer to stay in marginal production. When most of the people in that town will know they're marginal producers. And ironically, you get this situation where people are reluctant to invest in their community because they know that at the stroke of a government pen, it might disappear. The best way of using government money, the way that creates the best future for the people involved, is to spend money retraining those workers, relocating those workers, getting new industries to set up in those towns that have a clearly viable future in a carbon-constrained world. I guess the report starts with a philosophy that we are going to live in a carbon-constrained world, and what we need to do as Australians is structure our economy so that we are internationally competitive in that carbon-constrained world, and the faster we start moving there, the faster that our economy and the more successful our economy will be for the future.
So thank you very much to everybody for coming, and thank you to John and Tristan. It was a terrific discussion. Thank you, Adam.